December 24th, 1944. The sky over western Germany burns red. Tracer rounds streak through freezing air like fireflies of death. Inside a crippled B-17, Lieutenant Charles Red Monroe fights to keep the bomber level. The engines cough, the gauges spin, and the crew braces for impact. He pulls the handle, a rush of wind. Silence. Then, the sudden crack of parachute cords unfurling against the black winter sky. Below him, endless white fields stretch beneath the smoke of distant towns. He hits the ground hard, rolling through snow. His breath fogs, his ribs ache, his hands tremble. Within minutes, boots crunch nearby. German soldiers shouting, rifles raised. They strip him of maps, rations, and his sidearm. But in his flight jacket, overlooked, lies something small. A deck of playing cards. To the guards, it's harmless. To Monroe, it's hope in disguise. Because within those 52 cards lies a secret that could change everything. A hidden path home. And soon, he'll have to play the hand of his life. By the closing months of 1944, the air war over Europe had become a storm of metal and fire. From England's mist-shrouded airfields, waves of American B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators crossed the channel each dawn, their silver wings glinting above the clouds. Their targets, the industrial arteries of Hitler's Reich, rail lines, oil refineries, and weapons plants buried deep inside Germany. The cost was staggering. Every mission meant threading through flak bursts that could shred a bomber in seconds. German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs sliced through formations like hawks through doves. For every 100 men who took off, barely 70 returned. Lieutenant Monroe was one of thousands of young Americans drawn into this deadly chess match in the sky. Men barely out of college, trained to navigate by stars and courage. When their aircraft fell, their fight did not end. It merely changed terrain. Those who survived the descent were marched through hostile villages to prisoner-of-war camps scattered across the Reich. Officially, the Third Reich claimed to follow the Geneva Convention. In reality, conditions depended on who guarded you and where you landed. For Allied airmen, capture often meant transfer to Stalag Luft compounds, prison camps run by the Luftwaffe rather than the SS. The Germans prided themselves on order and efficiency. POWs were given bunks, thin rations, and the illusion of routine. But behind the barbed wire, an invisible war unfolded, one of patience, deception, and endurance. By 1944, escape had become an unofficial duty. Inside these camps, Allied officers organized themselves like underground armies. Command structures, intelligence cells, forgery workshops. Men tunneled under fences with tin cans, built compasses from phonograph needles, and smuggled radio parts inside Red Cross parcels. What the Germans never fully understood was that even before capture, Allied intelligence had been preparing for this reality. In London, a secret branch known as MI9 worked with American counterparts to design escape aids, compact survival tools hidden inside everyday objects. Their mission: give captured airmen a chance, no matter how small, to get back home. These inventions were marvels of wartime ingenuity. Razor blades magnetized to point north, maps printed on silk so they wouldn't rustle when folded, buttons that unscrewed into miniature compasses, and perhaps most ingenious of all, playing cards that concealed maps between their layers of paper. When dampened and peeled apart, each card revealed a fragment of geography. Rivers, roads, railways, that together formed an escape route across Europe. To the guards, it was a deck for passing idle hours. To a desperate pilot, it was a key to freedom. In the chaos of 1944, as Allied forces pushed toward the Rhine and German defenses began to collapse, the skies grew even more dangerous. Anti-aircraft fire intensified, and Luftwaffe pilots, cornered yet defiant, fought with the fury of men defending their homeland. That winter, Lieutenant Monroe's squadron took off on what should have been a routine daylight strike. It ended in flame and captivity, and within days he found himself behind wire, facing the same question every captured airman asked himself: how do I get out? The answer, though he didn't yet know it, would come in the form of 52 silent allies waiting in his coat pocket. The camp lay on a flat, frozen plain, a forest of wire and watchtowers under the dull German sky. To the men inside, it was both prison and battlefield, where time itself was the enemy. Lieutenant Monroe was assigned to a compound of fellow Allied airmen, many of them veterans of downed raids over Bremen, Leipzig, and the Ruhr. Their uniforms were patched with frost, their faces carved by hunger and boredom. Yet beneath the bleak routine, a quiet defiance pulsed through the barracks. Each morning the prisoners lined up for appel, the head count. Each evening, They traded rumors of the advancing Allies, tracing invisible front lines on scraps of newspaper. Between these rituals they plotted, not in whispers of revolt but in the careful language of patience. For them, escape wasn't just a dream, it was duty. A successful breakout could force the Germans to divert guards, trucks, and manpower, resources that might otherwise fight the war. Every tunnel dug, every forged paper, every smuggled radio signal was another thread in the vast Allied web of resistance behind the wire. What Monroe didn't yet realize was that this secret war stretched far beyond the fences of his camp. Across the Channel in London's Baker Street, MI9's engineers and artists were quietly rewriting the rules of captivity. They worked alongside American intelligence officers and private manufacturers to hide maps, compasses, and coded messages inside mundane items sent through Red Cross relief packages. The U.S. Playing Card Company of Cincinnati, Ohio, was one such partner. Their decks, outwardly ordinary, concealed a miracle of precision. Between each card's printed layers, technicians inserted thin sheets of map paper, waterproof, foldable, nearly invisible. When peeled apart and reassembled, the deck formed a complete escape map of Europe, highlighting rail routes to neutral Switzerland or Sweden. The idea was as audacious as it was elegant. Smuggle hope into hopeless places, disguised as leisure. To make it work, coordination was essential. MI9 agents passed coded signals to select POW camps, subtle cues in radio broadcasts, or prearranged symbols in Red Cross shipments, alerting inmates that their parcels contained more than food or entertainment. Only the senior officers, the escape officers, knew the full system. They distributed the aids in secret, ensuring the Germans never suspected the scale of the operation. By late 1944, the program had already saved hundreds of men. British and American airmen who broke free using these disguise tools often rejoined their units within weeks, guided by resistance networks across France and Belgium. But for every man who made it, dozens languished behind wire, waiting for an opportunity that might never come. Inside Monroe's camp, guards grew restless. The war was turning against them. Supplies dwindled, tempers flared, searchlights swept the fences longer each night. The Germans could sense their own defeat approaching, but that only made them more dangerous. One evening, while sorting his few possessions, Monroe found the deck, crisp, red-backed, still wrapped in thin cellophane. A gift, apparently, from a Red Cross parcel. He thought little of it at first. Poker games were one of the few distractions left to the men, a way to kill hours between roll calls and rations. But over the next days, subtle details began to gnaw at him. The paper felt thicker than usual. The edges didn't align perfectly, and faintly when held to the light, some cards showed thin shadows beneath their faces. Something was hidden there, something someone wanted him to find. As the snow deepened and the camp grew quieter, Monroe's mind began to race. What if the deck wasn't a game at all, but a message? Soon, he would learn the truth, and with it, the beginning of his plan. Captivity in wartime is not only a physical confinement, it is a slow erosion of the mind. For the airmen of Stalag Luft III and its sister camps, each day blurred into the next. They woke to the bark of guards, the clang of tin cups, the thin ration of bread that smelled faintly of sawdust. Snow sifted through cracks in the barracks roof, melting into their blankets. Letters from home arrived months late, often censored into silence. Yet within that monotony, the prisoners built a strange kind of resilience. They taught languages, staged plays, carved chess pieces from soap. In small acts of creativity, they reclaimed fragments of their stolen humanity. Games, especially cards, then became vital psychological medicine. The shuffle of a deck meant noise, color, and control. When you played, you forgot the fences. Monroe joined nightly poker sessions with men who had once flown beside him. Each hand was a conversation without words, a defiant reminder that the Germans could cage their bodies, not their will. But beneath the laughter, every man knew that somewhere beyond the floodlights lay freedom. And the question was no longer if they would try to reach it, but how. War breeds invention, and captivity sharpened it to a fine edge. By 1943, British and American intelligence agencies had turned escape planning into an industrial art. At MI9's secret workshops in London, draftsmen, mapmakers, and craftsmen labored around the clock designing objects that looked ordinary but concealed extraordinary purpose. Each invention had to pass 3 tests: plausible, durable, and deniable. The playing card map was among the most ingenious. Manufacturers glued 2 thin sheets of cardstock together with a hidden silk map sandwiched inside. When soaked in water, the layers separated cleanly, revealing terrain in astonishing detail. Rivers, roads, forest lines, even the gradients of mountain passes. To guard secrecy, only specific batches were modified, distributed through controlled Red Cross shipments marked with coded identifiers invisible to German inspectors. Parallel efforts in the United States refined the process. The U.S. playing card company's engineers experimented with adhesive formulas that wouldn't distort under humidity, and inks that wouldn't bleed when exposed to moisture. Their final product looked utterly conventional, bicycle decks identical to those sold in any American store. To the untrained eye, they were harmless. To a trapped pilot, they were salvation folded in cellulose. These devices reflected a larger truth about Allied warfare. Victory often depended as much on intellect as on firepower. While factories built bombers, artisans built hope. One false label, one silk thread, one deck at a time. Inside the camps, the ingenuity continued. Prisoners learned to decode subtle signals, a certain serial number on a Red Cross form, an ink color, a packaging fold. They fashioned tools from scraps, compasses from gramophone needles, digging boards from bed slats, maps copied onto cigarette papers with melted margarine ink. Each discovery was passed through the grapevine of trust, spreading across compounds like a whispered hymn. Monroe absorbed these lessons quickly. He watched the veterans memorize their habits, noted the way they hid contraband under floorboards or inside hollow table legs. To the guards, he was another weary pilot passing time with cards. In reality, each shuffle brought him closer to understanding that survival here was not about strength. It was about imagination. And somewhere within that deck, he sensed the next move was waiting. Every successful escape began not with tools but with information. Maps, guard schedules, compass bearings. These were the true weapons of captivity. Without them, men vanished into snowfields and forests, never to be seen again. With them, even a lone airman could navigate hundreds of miles toward freedom. Within the camps, escape officers acted like generals of a silent army. They cataloged every parcel that arrived, tracing the origin of soap tins, shaving brushes, and decks of cards. They mapped the rhythms of the guards, when they grew bored, when they smoked, when they changed shifts. They even studied the dogs, how far the animals ranged, how keen their sense of smell was at night. Monroe listened, observed, and learned. The deck he carried became more than a pastime. It was a potential blueprint. Late at night, under dim candlelight stolen from Red Cross tins, he examined each card closely. At first, nothing. Then one evening, after breathing gently onto the paper's surface, he saw faint bubbles along the edge, an imperfection no factory should have left. He soaked a card in water, waited, and then, with trembling fingers, he separated its layers. Inside was a strip of fine silk printed with contour lines and faint red roads, a fragment of Europe. Piece by piece, he worked through the deck, careful never to alert the guards. When he laid the fragments together, a realization struck him. The route stretched west across the Rhine toward France, toward the advancing Allies. It was a path home, disguised as a game. Now came the hard part, how to use it without dying trying. The Germans were not blind to the ingenuity of their captives. From the first great escapes at Colditz and Stalag Luft III, they had learned to expect deception in every parcel. Packages were x-rayed, cut open, inspected by intelligence officers trained in spotting anomalies. Double seams, unnatural stitching, extra thickness in paper. But the sheer scale of wartime logistics worked in the Allies' favor. By 1944, hundreds of tons of Red Cross aid crossed Europe each month. Camps depended on them for survival, and even the Germans feared international outrage if shipments were halted entirely. Within this sea of ordinary goods, the few special parcels blended perfectly. Still, Gestapo agents occasionally uncovered evidence: hollowed chess pieces, modified razors, silk maps hidden in toothpaste tubes. Each discovery led to interrogations, searches, punishment. The prisoners called it the quiet battle. One fought not with guns but with wits. Monroe saw it firsthand. A neighboring hut was raided after a tunnel collapse exposed a stockpile of contraband. The men were confined, their rations cut. For weeks afterward, guards tore through every possession, overturning beds and stomping on decks of cards. Monroe kept his poker set close, never out of sight, his demeanor casual, unthreatening. He understood that his safety lay in invisibility. If the Germans suspected nothing, his cards remained weapons unseen. Every game he played became camouflage. Each laugh, each bet, a performance in plain sight. The more harmless he seemed, the safer his secret became. To deceive was to survive, yet the moral weight of that deception lingered. For men raised on honor and open combat, lying to the enemy felt like walking a thin line. But captivity rewrote the rules. Inside the wire, morality was no longer about pride. It was about purpose. The Allied code was clear. Duty did not end with capture. If you could resist, you resisted. If you could escape, you tried. Each man who slipped free tied up dozens of German soldiers in the search, pulling them away from the front lines. Even failure had value. Monroe wrestled with the risk. To attempt escape was to invite death, not just for himself, but for those who helped him. Yet doing nothing was another kind of death, slower and quieter. One evening, during a rare moment of calm, he spread the map fragments beneath his blanket, tracing the red line west with his fingertip. He thought of home, the warmth of Ohio summers, the sound of riverboats on the Mississippi. He folded the silk carefully, tucking it inside his flight jacket. In that moment, the decision was made. The deck was no longer a secret. It was a promise. And the next hand he played would be for his life. Night came early that winter, a heavy, starless dark pressed down by snow and silence. From his bunk, Monroe listened to the familiar sounds of captivity, the creak of timber walls, the rattle of the guard's lantern chain, the coughs of men dreaming of open skies. For weeks he had prepared in increments, each act deliberate, each gesture innocent on the surface. He traded cigarette rations for scraps of pencil graphite, marked the map's edges with faint orientation notes, and memorized the route as if rehearsing a prayer. He studied the guards' movements, the rhythm of their boots on frozen ground, the seconds between their lantern swings, the moments they lingered to light cigarettes. He waited for patterns, and patterns appeared. The third night watchman, a corporal named Eberhard, always paused behind Hut 6 to warm his hands near the chimney vent. For 30 seconds each round, that patch of fence stood unwatched. 30 seconds. No more, no less. Monroe chose his night carefully. December 28th, when snow muffled footsteps and cloud cover dimmed the moon. Escape attempts had grown rarer as the war dragged on. Men were tired, beaten by months of starvation and failed tunnels. But for Monroe, inaction had become unbearable. Each passing day, he felt the war slipping toward its end, and with it the meaning of his duty. He approached two trusted comrades, veterans of previous escape attempts. They helped him fashion essentials: a fake identification tag made from tin, a crude compass magnetized over a fire, a ration tin converted into a canteen. They pressed his hand in silence, knowing the odds, understanding the risk. When the appointed night arrived, he hid the silk fragments under his shirt, wrapping them against his ribs. The deck itself he carried openly in his jacket pocket. To any guard, he was simply another restless prisoner passing time with cards. The cold outside was merciless. Breath crystallized instantly in the air. He slipped from the barracks at the turn of the watch, crouching low beneath the line of windows. Behind him, the camp slept. Before him, the perimeter fence glimmered faintly. 2 layers of barbed wire separated by a narrow death strip of raked snow meant to show footprints. Beyond that, the forest. Freedom. He moved when Eberhard reached his usual post, watching the man's lantern glow fade behind the hut. Heart-pounding, Monroe crossed the first stretch of snow on his knees, spreading his weight to leave no trace. He reached the outer fence, fingers numb, and began to cut the wire with a blade stolen weeks before, a shaving razor edge bound to a wooden handle. Each motion was agony. The wire was cold, brittle, singing softly as it parted. He paused once when a searchlight swept near, freezing in the snow like a fallen branch. When the beam moved on, he continued, muscles trembling. At last, he wriggled through, tearing his sleeve but clearing the barrier. He pressed his body into the ground, listening. No shouts, no alarms, only the slow hum of wind through pine. He crawled into the trees and stood, gasping quietly. Behind him, Stalag Luft vanished into darkness. Ahead, hundreds of miles of hostile territory. He pulled out the first card fragment, unfolding it by touch. The silk map caught the faint starlight, its lines shimmering like veins. He oriented himself using the compass sewn inside a button on his cuff, true north glinting under a sliver of frost. Then, with the precision of a navigator once more, he began to walk. Every step was a gamble, every breath a wager. The deck had dealt its hand, and Monroe was playing for freedom. The forest swallowed him whole. Snow whispered underfoot, branches brushed his shoulders, and each sound, a snapping twig, a distant bark, felt amplified against the silence. He moved only by night, hiding in barns, ditches, and the shells of bombed-out cottages by day. The cold became his shadow. Frost crept into his boots, turned his fingers raw, but the fear of capture kept him moving. For food, he scavenged what the countryside offered: frozen turnips, stale bread from unattended windowsills, sometimes nothing at all. He drank from streams and melted snow in his hands. When exhaustion overtook him, he pressed his back to a tree and repeated the route from memory. Rhine, Saar, Metz, then France. Every name was a heartbeat closer to home. He crossed roads at night, listening for the rumble of German patrol trucks. On the fourth night, while following the edge of a rail line marked on the silk map, he heard the low hum of an engine and ducked into a drainage culvert. A convoy rolled past, soldiers in greatcoats, rifles across their chests. At the tail, a jeep stopped. Voices, a lantern. Light swept across the ditch, catching his breath in his throat. Then it moved on. Hours later, as dawn grayed the horizon, he stumbled upon a small village, half ruined, its church steeple shattered by shellfire. He needed to cross it to reach the river. But his uniform, though stripped of insignia, still marked him as foreign, and the Rhine was guarded by patrols. Checkpoints, sentries, dogs. He waited until dusk before entering. Smoke curled from chimneys, the smell of boiled cabbage drifting through the streets. He walked with a limp, head bowed, his jacket collar raised high. In his hand he carried the deck of cards, fanning it idly as though a bored traveler seeking warmth in an inn. He didn't notice the soldier until the voice cut through the cold. "Halt!" A flashlight beam hit his face. A Wehrmacht sergeant stepped forward, rifle raised, eyes narrow. Monroe froze, heartbeat thundering. The sergeant barked questions and fast, sharp. Monroe understood little German, only enough to catch papers in unit. He shook his head, fumbled in his pocket, pretending confusion. The cards spilled into the snow. The sergeant frowned, gesturing impatiently. Monroe crouched, gathering the scattered cards, his fingers trembling. Then in a sudden flash of instinct, he performed, exactly as he'd seen street magicians do back home. He smiled faintly, shuffled the cards with practiced rhythm, and held one out toward the German. The man hesitated. "Spielkarten?" Monroe nodded. "Game for luck." The soldier relaxed slightly, curiosity softening suspicion. Monroe flipped a card from the top, showed the ace of hearts, then palmed it neatly into his sleeve. A harmless trick, or so it seemed. The sergeant smirked, exhaled, and waved him on. "Gehen Sie, schnell." Monroe bowed in mock gratitude, heart pounding as he stepped away, the deck still warm in his palm. Only when he turned the corner did his composure break. He leaned against a wall, breath sharp and ragged, realizing how close he'd come, that bluff, that deck, and had just saved his life. By midnight, he reached the Rhine. The current was strong, swollen with winter melt. Across the water, faint artillery flashes marked the front line. American guns somewhere beyond the fog. He stripped off his boots, tied them to his belt, and stepped into the freezing current. The shock stole his breath. He swam with everything left in him, arms burning, teeth locked against the cold. Halfway across, a flare went up behind him, white fire slicing the dark. Shouts echoed from the eastern bank. He forced himself onward, lungs screaming, fingers clawing through the current. Then a silence. Only the rush of water and the thud of his own pulse. When he crawled onto the western shore, his hands met mud, not ice. He looked up to see a helmeted figure silhouetted against the night, a sentry's voice shouting, this time in English. "Hold it. Identify yourself." Monroe collapsed, gasping, voice hoarse. "Lieutenant Charles Monroe, United States Army Air Forces, prisoner of war. Escaped." For a moment, nothing. Then the sentry's tone changed. Disbelief, then relief. "Jesus Christ. We got one alive." They pulled him up, wrapped him in a blanket, and led him toward the warmth of an Allied outpost tent. In his pocket, waterlogged but intact, the deck of cards clung together, its ink bleeding faintly, its secret purpose fulfilled. When Monroe awoke, it was to the smell of coffee and disinfectant. A nurse leaned over him, smiling faintly. "You're in France, Lieutenant. You're safe now." For the first time in months, he didn't hear boots outside his door. No barking dogs, no sirens. Only the low hum of generators and the crackle of Allied radio chatter. He slept for nearly a full day. When he finally stirred, an officer from Army Intelligence sat waiting beside his cot, clipboard in hand, polished boots, eyes sharp behind round spectacles. "Lieutenant Monroe, we've been very eager to speak with you." The debriefing stretched for hours. Monroe described the crash, the capture, the camp, and his escape. When he reached the part about the deck of cards, the officer leaned forward, interest sparking. "You said the maps were inside the cards themselves?" Monroe nodded, recounting how the paper had peeled away underwater, revealing the hidden silk maps within. The officer exchanged glances with his aide, a look of quiet satisfaction. "Good. That confirms it worked." "It worked?" Monroe asked, confused. The man smiled. "Lieutenant, those weren't standard issue. What you carried was part of an experimental program developed by British intelligence, MI9. We called them escape packs. Yours came through under a joint arrangement with the American AAF. Not many knew they existed. He explained how MI9 had partnered with a London toy manufacturer, Waddington's, makers of Monopoly and playing cards, to create covert tools for downed airmen. Each deck, ordinary to the eye, was actually a layered construction, 2 thin sheets of cardboard bonded together with a silk map hidden inside. The design was genius in its simplicity, harmless looking, easy to smuggle in Red Cross parcels and nearly impossible for the Germans to detect. Once in camp, prisoners only needed water. A little soak loosened the adhesive, revealing escape routes printed in microscopic precision, railway lines, river crossings, safe paths through occupied territory. Monroe listened in stunned silence. He had assumed the cards were a morale trinket, a small comfort from home. He hadn't realized he'd been carrying one of the war's most elaborate secrets. The officer closed his file. You're one of the few to make it back with the maps intact. We'll need them, and your account, for further analysis. Monroe reached into his jacket pocket. The deck was still there, warped and faded from the river. He handed it over carefully. The officer took it as though handling a sacred artifact. For the next several weeks, Monroe remained under medical observation, gaining weight and strength, but he never quite lost the habit of glancing over his shoulder. He received a letter from home, his mother's handwriting trembling but joyful. They told us you were missing. Now they say you're alive. God bless whoever kept you safe. When war correspondents later interviewed him, Monroe said little about the cards. The project remained classified for decades. Even among veterans, it became rumor, a whispered legend about magic decks that showed the way home. It wasn't until the 1970s that the truth surfaced, when declassified MI9 files revealed the full extent of their ingenuity, hollowed-out shaving brushes, record players hiding compasses, and yes, those decks of playing cards that could unfold into maps of escape. By then, Monroe was an old man. He kept one card framed on his wall, the Ace of Hearts, its edges frayed, its color long faded. Visitors sometimes asked why. He'd smile, glance at it, and say, "That little thing once fooled the whole German army." And in that single, quiet line, the story of thousands of airmen who gambled everything for one last chance at freedom lived on. History remembers the thunder of engines, the blaze of artillery, the roar of victory. But just as often, wars are won in silence, in the smallest acts of cleverness, passed hand to hand like secrets between men who refused to surrender. Lieutenant Monroe's escape was not a grand battle or a turning point in strategy. It was a single man, armed with nothing but his will and a deck of cards, defying the machinery of captivity. Yet in that defiance, there was something larger, the spirit of a generation that believed no cage could outthink the human mind. The playing cards were only one strand in a vast web of innovation spun by MI9 and its American allies. Their mission was simple but profound, to give hope to the captured. Every hidden compass, every coded message, every disguised map whispered the same promise: you are not forgotten. When the truth finally surfaced decades later, it astonished historians. A toy company had outsmarted the Gestapo. Ordinary objects, a deck of cards, a shaving brush, a Monopoly board, had become lifelines across enemy lines. And behind each invention stood quiet engineers, artists and soldiers who understood that survival often depends not on strength, but on imagination. For Monroe, that lesson endured long after the war. He returned home, raised a family, lived a quiet life. But on his bookshelf, beside the faded photographs and medals, he kept that single Ace of Hearts. It was not a trophy nor a souvenir, and it was a reminder that courage sometimes looks like patience, that intelligence can be a weapon, and that freedom, in its purest form, begins as a thought, small enough to fit inside a single playing card. As historians continue to study the machinery and tactics of World War II, Monroe's story remains a different kind of legacy, one not of destruction but of design, a testament to those who fought not only with bullets but with brilliance. Because in a war defined by power, it was often the quietest ideas that made the loudest escape.